Intel is finally trying to unbend its CPUs, despite having to be on a bender to buy its $630 285K from Arrow Lake. Just, losing my knee. Today's testing also includes some specialized pressure scanning to produce these pseudo-color images of pressure distribution across the IHS surface, as well as very brief thermal testing to look at the differences with Noctua's LBC, or low base convexity, flat cold plate, and we'll look at the mechanical aspects as well. So Intel has two loading mechanisms now, or ILMs, and unfortunately the better one, the new one, is optional. It is the RL-ILM, or reduced load ILM, and you can find it on some boards, so it's on RZ890 Hero, but Intel also still has what they call the standard ILM, and the naming of standard there may be indicating, always cut away from yourself and towards anyone else in the room with you, indicating that it is probably the default. We missed a few. One moment. Oh my God, there's one more. As I was saying, indicating that standard is maybe considered a default, even though right now on the high-end boards, it's the RL-ILM that you'll find. So we're testing both of these. There's 3 different suppliers of the standard at least. There might be more of RL, but we only have the one so far. Before that, this video is brought to you by Montech and the King95 Pro case. The King95 Pro is a dual chamber enclosure with configurable options for storage and power supplies. The K95 has a deep 35mm cable channel for management, support for dual power supplies if you want it, which could be useful for a Threadripper system, and ample radiator and fan mounting options scattered around the top, back, bottom, side, and front of the case. The front also can be mesh or solid, with the mesh running a higher porosity for more breathability. Learn more at the link in the description below. We have viewers of all levels of knowledge for computer hardware. We're going to start with some basic education, and then we'll get into some of the details and go over the differences of the ILMs, or the independent loading mechanisms. So, sockets are one part electrical and one part mechanical. The mechanical is pretty obvious. Sometimes when people talk about the socket, they're talking about this entire thing, which includes the mechanical, the independent loading mechanism, or the ILM as Intel calls it, and the pins, or the electrical part under it. Sometimes people are only referring to the literal socket, but of course I think everyone in this audience is aware that this is how the mechanism works. You open it up with a single lever. Now if we get in, and we'll talk about this more a little later, but you can see the way this clamps down. This is going to be important, even if it's super basic. It's got the side-to-side play, which we'll come back to. It applies force at these edges. Now this is the new independent loading mechanism. This is the RL-ILM, or the reduced load independent loading mechanism. With everything in place, of course, as many of you know, when you actually move the lever, what's going to happen is this bar here applies some physical force to the top up here, and it ends up clamping the whole thing down. So it ends up looking like that. So that is the functionality of it. As far as on a pure technicality, the literal socket is the pins here with this plastic carrier around it that actually hosts the CPU and secures it in place, whereas this piece, so that's the footing that's attached to, the screws, the lever, and this piece, that's the ILM. So that's kind of what we're talking about today. So Intel's 2 types of ILM is totally up to the motherboard manufacturer which they want to use. This Z890 board, again, it uses the RL-ILM. There's 2 ways to identify them if you were to look at a retailer page or something, you're not sure if they don't tell you. One is just looking up here for RL-ILM, that's reduced load. The other is to look for the socket cover, which we've got a separate shot of, we'll pop in as B-roll, which says the force requirements. They require at least 35 pounds of force for the coolers, and we'll go over why that is in a second. Now, for the standard ILMs, there are at least 3 suppliers where we've got one from each here. As far as we're aware, they are, or they should be identical, just different suppliers. Lotz is the one we have. I don't know if that's how that's pronounced. Is it German? Maybe it's Lattes or something, or maybe it's French and it's Noctua. I don't know. But I'm going to go with Lotz because I'm American. So that's what we have on ours. We're going to show this mounted instead of the RL-ILM today on this ASUS board. So that's kind of the main thing we're showing. So here's the deal. This is a CAD render of the ILM in the socket. The standard ILM has an angle that increases the force application along the edges of the CPU. That's the real difference here. This is what causes the depression that we've seen in the previous 3D scans, the laser scans we've performed. And these scans are from our past content, but you can see how the ILM causes significant bending and forms a central concavity with the heat spreader. This means that flatter, cooler cold plates could be worse on Intel despite being better on AMD. We have 2 different videos on that. We'll link below if you want to see the thermal data supporting that statement. Now back to the CAD model, the RL-ILM is basically just flat. This is the biggest change where you can see the bend in the metal is no longer there. The force should be reduced at the area it contacts the IHS or the integrated heat spreader as a result. This is also why Intel requires a higher force heatsink to be installed in order to ensure contact. The RL-ILM has one other slight difference we noticed. There's this adhesive spacer on the underside, which can be thought of as similar to the washer mod that Noctua now ships with its D15G2 coolers as an optional thing. In terms of what they've actually done, they've basically just put this white adhesive pad underneath the existing black adhesive pad, so the RL-ILM has 2 pieces of adhesive double stacked. They didn't even cut out the additional holes in the white one, actually. And that basically looks to us like these parts of the ILMs were already done, because they haven't changed the feet for these, and so they retrofitted these to try and save some money. In our original Thermal Grizzly contact frame benchmark, we showed how the ILM clamp appeared to very slightly apply higher pressure to one side of the socket. This was exaggerated by the fact that the ILM has some play side to side in it, where it can shift side to side and be repositioned, and we saw that still happens on the RL-ILM. Here's our 3D render of the standard ILM with the CPU dropped into the socket. The standard ILM uses a hook that's attached with the lever centrally to press down on the ILM lid that clamps the IHS. With the lever fully down and secured, the ILM now hooks at 3 points. There's 2 at the bottom and 1 at the top. All of this is the same on the new RL-ILM. As for the CPU, the ILM has 2 wings that press down on the IHS at the borders, and with that curvature we showed in the CAD model, the force application at these points is high enough that a highly precise gauge can show how light is able to shine through despite the CPU being relatively flat when unclamped and looking flat to the eye. We'll refer you to our Thermal Grizzly contact frame benchmark from 2022 if you want to learn more about the basics of the older style ILM. From the user standpoint though, usability-wise, there's absolutely no difference between this one and the standard one. It functions identically. You're not really going to notice a difference visually, at least. You might feel a little bit more force as you get towards the bottom end of that lever rotation, but that's really the only difference you'll notice. The CPU, however, as you can see back here, and we'll get into this today, there are huge differences in some very specific places, and you're mostly going to see it right here, where we've got this dip down right at the middle from that high force centrally on those wings that we've been talking about. So that's kind of the key area we're going to be looking today for where these differences materialize. I mean, we're at micron levels of differences, so that's why you can't see it. But the CPU definitely feels the difference, if it could feel. I mean, there's no evidence that it can't, but if it could, it would feel the difference. And finally, as we showed 2 years ago, too much or too little force can cause boot issues and high clock memory stability problems. We have this quote from Der Bauer, or Roman, from Thermal Grizzly previously talking about that. All this comes at a time when Noctua just got done making 3 different cold plate variations of its NHD15G2, which we have a whole separate in-depth review on. And whether or not you're interested in buying the cooler, the cold plate part is pretty interesting. So this is the LBC model, no relation to Snoop Dogg. That means low base convexity. There's also the high base convexity models and the standard models. And that means that this is basically the perfect candidate as a test platform to look at Intel's changes, because low base convexity should mean, and we proved it in our 3D scans, that this is a relatively flat plate. High base means it comes out more towards the CPU, the point being that on these older styles, or even Arrow Lake to a lesser degree with the standard ILM, the highly convex cold plate will sort of socket into the concavity in the CPU IHS. And so that's kind of the reason for Noctua making it the way they did. And that's what we're going to use for a lot of our pressure testing today. Now, the pressure testing is done with a specialized paper, looks something like this when it's done, which we sit between the CPU. So we put a strip of it in there, and the Coldplate. And then we basically take the scans and we put them into a specialized and calibrated scanner that scans for pressure, and it produces what we call a pseudo-color image, meaning it's all these different colors to give us an idea for how the pressure is distributed. We can get PSI if we want, Pascal, stuff like that. So here are the results for the two ILM types with the HBC cooler, the high base convexity one, meaning the very curved one. The new reduced load ILM with the high base convexity Noctua Coldplate yielded low pressure at the outer edges, but especially toward the top of the board near the VRM and the EPS 12-volt cables. The pressure essentially remained high. However, because the CPU should be flatter with this ILM, the Noctua cooler ends up with less evenly distributed pressure because it's designed for a different scenario. The standard ILM with HBC cooler scans reinforce this. The HBC cooler ends up with more evenly distributed pressure at the top and bottom edges of the CPU IHS. And here's only the RL-ILM with the 3 Noctua cooler cold plates. The RL-ILM pressure distribution was the most evenly distributed with the standard and LBC solutions. The two are mostly indistinguishable for distribution, although the precise pressure centrally will influence the results in thermal testing later. The LBC cooler had slight gaps at the left and right edges, but consistently squared distribution at the top and bottom corners with good pressure across the entire center. The standard cooler had less consistent pressure at the top and bottom edges and similar gaps to LBC at the edges. Ultimately, though, these two look basically the same for contact. Our Noctua NHD15G2 review went into more depth with laser scans of the cooler's cold plates, and that hasn't changed. We're showing the LBC, standard, and HBC scans again briefly here just to help recap the impact, because when we're looking at pressure and how it is affected by the ILM, the cold plate is a part of that equation. When we magnify these, really what we're talking about is microns of difference at the actual IHS level. So it's very small. You can check out our G2 review for more on all of that. For any of this to make sense though, we need to actually scan the new CPUs with the laser scanner to see how their curvature, or lack thereof, matches with the pressure scans that we saw earlier for those Noctua plates. So we need to throw that into the laser scanner, and we're gonna look at it both unsocketed and socketed. Here's a look at the plain Intel 285K when it's just flat in the laser scanner. The CPU isn't in a socket at all here, so this is as simple as it gets. Even in our 2D screenshots of the 3D scan that you see here, we can see the letters on the CPU IHS. It's so flat, relatively speaking, that the very slight indentation for the text is visible. The IHS itself has a few higher points, one just off center, one along the right edge when oriented in a legible orientation, and one just off the left edge of the CPU. Magnifying it 100x, the coloration grows to form just a few high points. Overall, the CPU is flat. It's not socketed here, so it should be. But at high magnification, some small deviations in the surface appear. One thing that is clear, though, is that there's no substrate curvature, which makes sense since, again, it's not in a socket. Let's create a grid with the 285K and add the 245K to it. The 245K follows a similar pattern. Centrally, it's a little higher. Then just off center right, it's also slightly higher when looking at 1x. Adding 100x to the grid, there's a similar pattern as with the 285K. Finally, we'll add our unsocketed 12900KS from the Golden Sample cold plate video. It's still flat when unsocketed, but the difference in IHS design is also showing through slightly. And now we're going to throw the Z890 Hero with the new ILM into the scanner and socket the CPUs in it. We obtained this package of ILMs to test. The ASUS board uses the Lotes RL-ILM, and so we'll start with that one. Here's a 1-to-1 3D visualization in Blender taking STL files from our laser scanner, showing the 285K with the standard ILM first. As usual, 1x magnification doesn't show much, but bringing that to 100x quickly shows a deep concavity centrally, just like we saw with the LGA 1700 CPUs. Switching over to the new reduced load socket, we can see that the 1 to 100x magnification shows less of a pronounced curvature forming in the IHS itself. It's still curved, but much less, with the CPU maintaining a more consistent height instead. Here's a grid comparison of the different ILMs on the same motherboard, tested with the same CPU, starting with the 285K. You can see that the standard ILM at 100x magnification shows a huge deflection centrally, as we've seen before, with higher pressure on the far ends of the mechanism. While we can sort of see the slight ridgeline down the middle of the CPU, the bigger issue is how deeply it indents. The reduced load socket is significantly flatter, with less of a central deflection. The ridgeline in the CPU IHS becomes more pronounced in the graphic because it's more consistently the highest thing in the image. Remember that this is at 100x magnification, so the differences are exaggerated intentionally. Unveiling the 245K results in the grid, we see the same patterns. The standard ILM deeply indents the CPU centrally, deflecting and deforming it in a way that cold plates with matching convexity will cool it the best. The reduced load socket is flatter and more consistent, though it's still slightly deflected centrally. We need a laser scan of the cooler cold plate before moving to the pressure maps, as the cooler and the IHS alike contribute to the pressure distribution. This laser scan shows the cold plate of the ASUS Ryujin liquid cooler, which is what Intel sent with its CPUs to reviewers. Other coolers would fit, and we're actually going to look at Noctua shortly, but we wanted to test what Intel officially endorsed for its reviews. At a 1x scale, the ASUS Ryujin cold plate looks relatively flat, but still shows a protrusion dead center, gradually reducing height towards the outer edges. When we did our in-depth testing on Intel performance with varying custom-made cold plates from Scythe, we found that this pattern often did well for Intel. Scaling at 100x, we get this almost comical tower protruding from the cold plate. This helps us see the steep slope as ASUS applies massive pressure dead center with its cold plate design. This is sort of a ham-fisted approach and version of what Noctua did more precisely with the D15G2 for LGA 1700, except Noctua had more nuance in the exact shape of the convexity, which would better align with the concavity in LGA 1700 CPU heat spreaders previously. What ASUS is doing here is similar to what we saw in the $60 Thermalright liquid cooler, which managed to brute force its way in performance thanks to similar protrusions. Now, additionally, we need to look at some pressure scans of the ASUS cooler that Intel shipped out with its review kits for these CPUs with the new ILMs installed. These two images show a new pressure scan of our 14900KF with the ASUS Ryujin liquid cooler and the old, or the standard, ILM. In this scan, you can see the 14900KF has narrowing pressure on the left and right sides, with most of its pressure centered. That's where it should be, and most of that is thanks to the comically protruding ASUS cold plate, but fuller coverage is ideal. Now, the older IHS also is a little bit different shape than the new one. That comes into play too. This is the pre-installed reduced load ILM using the 285K. Adding the standard ILM with the 285K, it doesn't look too different. The pressure profile appears to be distributed taller and narrower. There's still some of that slimming effect going on when we get to the left and right sides, but not nearly as pronounced as with the last gen IHS design and ILM. Ultimately, what we're seeing here is that ASUS's design works okay for the previous generation because they went with that sort of really brute force approach of just a massive protrusion dead center, just like Thermalright did with its $50 to $60 liquid coolers. And for the RL-ILM, or even the standard ILM, just with the modern changes to the IHS itself, the pressure distribution is simply not as good as we see with air coolers that are more appropriately shaped, like the Noctua one. Now, that doesn't mean that the Noctua cooler is better than a 360 because it isn't. Liquid, 3 fans, and a giant radiator are still going to perform better, and ASUS is really high pressure right in the middle, so it works. It's just that the ideal approach would be to sort of shape the cold plate to match what we're seeing today with the RL-ILM, the standard ILM, and the new IHS design. All right, so thermal testing's up now. Full transparency on this one, we kept it extremely simple as far as our testing standards go. Instead of using the ASUS Ryujin cooler, which has that, it's such a comical protrusion. I didn't put it back there because I didn't want to have to censor half of the background behind me, but it really sticks out, and that I think would throw off some of the testing thermally where it just might not be that representative. It's going to be representative of that cooler, but what we wanted to do was, because just changing the loading mechanism is going to be such a small impact probably to thermals, we really want to stress test it in a way that'll kind of bring those differences out. So we use the Noctua LBC model because in theory, the low base convexity version of this should be a worst case scenario for the standard ILM, and it should work a little better on the RL-ILM, which will flatten the CPU IHS out a little bit based on the pressure scans we've already looked at. So that's what we went with for the actual testing. Other coolers could have more or less impact. Coolers with higher force applications centrally and with more convexity would continue to compensate for design problems for the standard ILM, but we want to just run a quick evaluation on one of the uncompensated scenarios. We're also not testing anything below the minimum spec because Intel pretty openly declares what that is, and you shouldn't fall below it anyway. The minimum is 35 pounds of force from the cooler. Anything high-end that'd be paired with one of the current CPUs for Arrow Lake would meet or exceed this requirement anyway. Here's the really simple chart for the A/B test. For this testing, we did 2 full mounts and at least 3 passes to average the numbers. This allowed us to check for variance, mount to mount, some human error checking there, and it also stands up to our other CPU cooler standards and methodologies, like manually spreading the paste, using the same paste, controlling the fan speeds, and fixing the voltages and the frequency. We disabled all power and thermal limits and set a fixed voltage with fixed frequencies. We have a known power draw down the EPS 12 volt and 24-pin ATX 12 volt through the 4 phases that it has without PCIe slot power, and that allows us to get these numbers. And it's really simple. The result was 61.8 degrees delta T over ambient for average peak core temperature with the standard ILM and 59.6 delta T with the RL-ILM, or the improved one, meaning about a 2.2 degree reduction when accounting for ambient. Without the deltas, we were running the 285K in the 80s, up to low 90s for some of the cores, because we disabled all TVB 70-degree throttle controls. Running the CPU hotter allows us to see more of a gap between the results, and not allowing it to throttle means we get actually meaningful results. A CPU consuming less power with a stronger cooler would likely not show as big of a gap, so be prepared for that. Checking briefly with Der Bauer as a peer review, we learned our results are roughly in line with his own. The differences are aligned with the cooler and heat load differences that we both chose in our testing. We observed a slightly lower core-to-core delta with the new ILM, but it was within error. The average all-core temperatures were not significantly different from the P-core temperatures this time. It's partly due to the proximity of the P-cores and the E-cores in this architecture, combined with our adjustments in BIOS. So, as short as possible, the RL-ILM is about 2.2 degrees better at this heat load with this cooler. Before we conclude this, in case in the future you buy a motherboard with a standard ILM and you want to move from the high-pressure standard one to the low-pressure RL-ILM, you maybe buy one on eBay or something, we've got a section from Mike where he's going to walk through the process of this. And he's taking the RL-ILM off, but it's the exact same approach, and then he'll put the other one on.
So the sockets we'll be swapping today are the Lotes brand. We recommend you keep them the same brand to brand if you're going to swap this out, if possible, but it shouldn't really matter. So let's go ahead and take a look at our motherboard here. I've got the CPU already installed. And during this, I'm going to leave the CPU installed, and that's to protect the pins in case I drop a screw or hit it with part of the ILM mechanism. So if you watched any of our other contact frame coverage or content, you know that there's a back plate here, and we'll take a closer look at that once I get it out. This is just a regular T20 Torx for all 4 of these screws. And be careful because both the top and bottom pieces are actually individual pieces, so once I take this screw out, it will be free. There it goes. Now we're swapping to the high pressure socket here. We don't recommend that. We're just doing that for demonstration purposes. The process would be the same if you're going from a high pressure socket to the newer lower pressure socket. And there's our back plate. 3 different pieces of hardware, or 3 different components, and then 4 screws. So let's go ahead and install our higher pressure socket. So let's take a look at the back plate here for a second. The screws are offset, so the distance between these 2 screws and the 2 screws at the bottom is different, so it's kind of hard to get it oriented wrong. But just make sure that you don't have the metal touching the back of the motherboard. You want this kind of plastic sticker that they put on the back plate touching the motherboard, facing the motherboard. Additionally, there's also a notch here, and this lines up with the triangle that's on the corner of the CPU as well as the corner of the socket. Come around underneath here, get that roughly lined up, and then I'm just going to lay the lever arm here. I found this to be easier than doing the other piece first. And I'm going to get this first screw started. And I'm not going to tighten that one down quite yet. And I'm just lightly pushing up on that back plate here so that I can start this screw and get it threaded. Now I can't stress this enough, you really do not need a lot of torque here. So we're going to go caddy corner in a star pattern here as we just snug these up really gently. Really do not need a lot of torque on this. And I'll go one more time just to make sure that everything's nice and snug. Once that's done, you can go ahead and close your socket on your CPU and latch it, and you're all set.
What we're trying to do here is stress to pull out the biggest difference we reasonably can with a cooler someone might use. When I was speaking with Der Bauer during the sort of brief peer review check-in with him behind the scenes, it sounds like he's seen somewhere in the range of 3 degrees, which is, I mean, right there with 2.2 for what we're seeing. And even if it's up to 4 or something, that's pretty damn close. And for these types of differences, you're not going to see a lot anyway. The contact frames back in the early days, 12th gen, showed some of the biggest differences we saw, where the most we ever saw from one of those, I think, was 7 degrees. And that was a lot. That was like incredible. But the reason the contact frames can work a little bit better is they sort of fully rest on that outer edge of the CPU IHS. So you see that metal, I don't know, I'll call it a flange down there, that wing that comes out at the bottom around the whole side. A lot of the good contact frames will press down on that whole thing. It's a really flat distribution. And for coolers that are built to mate with that as flat as possible, that's going to work the best. So 2 degrees is kind of a lot to get just from the independent loading mechanism. That's a huge amount. A lot of times the coolers that we review are only a couple degrees apart when they're priced similarly. Even the best ones might only be 4 or 5 degrees better than something in the middle of the pack. So it really matters here. As one more example too, we did one round of tests where all of the Intel throttles were not fully off. So this was when I was still researching the platform and basically getting the R&D done to figure out what settings to use. So there's a setting we had left on where in that test it was still engaging some of those controls. And in that testing, we saw less than 1 degree difference. So it really matters how you test it, because in that scenario, it's not a fair comparison. That's why we don't have a chart for it, because what it's doing is it's pulling other things down, like the frequencies, in order to hit a target temperature, kind of like GPUs will do with the vBIOS set to target a certain temperature. And when that's the case, it's not a like-for-like comparison. You'd have to compare the frequencies instead or something. So just something to be aware of. So the RL-ILM, the new one, is definitely an objective improvement in both the curvature of the IHS and the substrate, and in the temperature during our brief testing. The pressure distribution depends on the cooler more than anything else, and it's not always clearly better, but the thermal result tells us that the net result is positive. Frustratingly, this is an optional part for motherboard makers. Intel is not at a stage where it should be making clear, simple, easy improvements optional for motherboard vendors. Although we don't want Intel or AMD to force certain lockdowns, like taking away overclocking features, we do think both companies should enforce a default or baseline configuration that's in the best interest of the consumer, with the option for the consumer to tweak it as their motherboard allows once exiting default settings, like in BIOS. Now, there might be some complexity where the 1851 and the 1700 ILMs are similar enough. Maybe there's millions of them out there somewhere of the standard one that it'd be better if they just go to use on something before Intel enforces it maybe on the next generation. But they need to move towards just saying, this is what you use, because the more Intel kind of throws its hands up and says, oh, the motherboard vendors keep screwing us over, the less it's kind of believable. You see that with the BIOS guidance that they've done previously, which has gotten them into a lot of trouble over the years. So we'd really like to see them force this, with the one caveat being, if it's a situation that came to this solution late and there's millions of the old ILMs out there, I don't know, whatever, throw them on the cheap boards, I guess. Maybe that makes sense to clear it out and then move on, because the cheaper the board is, the less likely it is a user uses a high-end CPU, and the less it's likely to really matter. Anyway, this doesn't seem like it'll kill the contact frame market. That'll still provide additional uplift on top of the RL-ILM, but the RL-ILM will eat away at some of the benefit that you might get from a contact frame. So the new ILM remains a mid-step improvement without going full flat like the prior contact frames. All right, that's it for this one. We probably won't do a ton of additional Arrow Lake follow-up testing at this point, just because there's not a lot of reasons to buy Arrow Lake anyway. So we're going to close it out for this mechanical laser thermal piece, and we have some additional content coming up, but that's most of the Arrow Lake stuff. We have all 3 of the CPUs that have launched so far reviewed on the channel. Check that out for more. And then on November 1st, we are going to be launching a new product on the store that we've been working on for a long time, and it's a little bit different from what you all are used to, because it's for tabletop gaming. So check back for that on November 1st, and check back again for our upcoming 9800X3D review, because that's coming out soon. Thanks for watching. We'll see you all next time.